Hey everyone, I'm here today with someone who I really admire, Mark Meckler. He did an interview with me recently after the supporting police video, and I got to know him a little bit. He's brilliant, so I brought him on the show today to introduce himself to everyone. So, Mark, thanks so much for being here. If you want to jump in and just give a background about yourself.
I would, yeah. Great to be with you. Thanks for having me. And I like a free form interview like this because usually people give me a long, like glorious introduction. That's not true. So I'll just tell you, I was born and raised in Los Angeles, not far from where you are right now. I was a Valley boy back in the day of the Valley Boys. I've always been what I would call a conservatarian, conservative libertarian. I was one of the co-founders of the Tea Party movement nationally, obviously it's kind of a right-wing conservative movement to restore fiscal sanity and constitutional fidelity to our country. And so was one of the people started that movement. I grew an organization called Tea Party Patriots to about 23 million members and 3,200 chapters. I left because I felt like it had been co-opted by the Republican Party. Oddly, I'm not a Republican. I'm not a Democrat. I'm an independent. I have been for a long time. When I left, I started an organization called Citizens for Self-Governance. The idea was to restore the idea of self-governance to our American political psyche. The idea that people should take personal responsibility, that governance should be as close to home as possible. Our main project is something called the Convention of States Project. That's to use Article 5 of the Constitution to call a state-based convention to propose amendments to the Constitution to take power away from the federal government, give it back to the states. Over 4 million people participating in that now, and I'm the
Wow,
president of that project.
that's amazing. It's interesting because before we started, you were talking about kind of your views on how the government should work, and I found it very interesting. I don't know if you want to just run down what we were talking about. You kind of just touched on it right now, but I like how you said, how I am in my own home is how I am in my own home, and then the question you said, which was
Well,
who
so,
gets to decide?
yeah, my fundamental view of politics, it comes through a single two-word question, and the question is who decides. That's the main fight, actually, that we're having in America right now. It's not about what should we do, it's about who decides. And I think primarily it should be at the individual level as much as practical. There is a concept in the Catholic Church, I'm not Catholic, but there's a concept in the Catholic Church called subsidiarity. And that is the idea that everything that can be decided at the most local level in the Catholic Church perspective, the parish level, should be, because those are the people who are being affected. And so when I look at that in terms of governance, anything that I can decide for myself, for me and my own family, I should be able to decide that. Anything that has to be on a city basis or county basis, we should do that there. Some things obviously can only be done on a statewide basis, like a state highway, things like that. Some things have to be done or nationally, like an interstate highway,
Yeah.
or internationally, like national defense and trade. So I think things need to be at the proper level. And if we do that, mostly we're going to get the right decisions, or at least better decisions.
Well, I fully agree because I think that people inherently want power, and the bigger the entity, the more power it will want and the more control it will want. So if we just give that up, if we stop saying, no, I'll protect my home before I'll protect my block. I'll protect my block before I'll protect my city. I'll protect my city before you know what I mean? You'll always kind of be more protective and handle things better. I can manage my home far better than I can manage my city on a smaller scale. And so I fully agree with you, and I've always kind of felt that way as well. At the end of
I want to weigh in on it. There's a nuance that I think is really important there, which is you might not handle it better. You might make bad decisions in
yeah.
your own home, right? It's possible, but if you make bad decisions in your own home and you're allowed to make those decisions, who do they affect? They affect you and your family primarily, right?
Yes.
And so if the effect is limited to the inside of your home, well, then who has a right to tell you what to do about that? And the same thing is, as we expand, if a city's allowed to do things, and they may do bad things, there are cities that operate in ways I don't agree with. I'm looking at Seattle right now. I don't agree with what's going on in Seattle, what the mayor's allowed to go on, and frankly, what the citizens are allowing to happen. But it's Seattle. If that's what they want for Seattle, I think they ought to be allowed. They're the only ones feeling the ill effects of that. I live in Texas. I'm not feeling any ill effects from what's going on in Seattle. So why is that any of my business? I don't really think it is.
No, you're right. And as you grow that, it obviously would become more dangerous if bad decisions are being fully made by the biggest entity that can affect everyone, and we have no say on it as individuals. Obviously, that's going to have a more negative outcome.
Right.
So I like that you corrected me on that, actually, because it's true. If I want to make a bad decision in my home, it doesn't always have to be a good decision. It's my choice. And I think just touching on what's going on with police right now, with everything going on right now, do you believe that if we kind of got back to a smaller level with approaching these problems, that it would solve a lot of what we see?
I do fundamentally. And one of the things, it's kind of funny, I find myself in a little bit of agreement with the whole defund the police mantra. I don't think we should defund the police. I think it's unequivocally been demonstrated by study after study. If you withdraw the police from communities, crime goes up. We're seeing that in spades right now. Crime is exploding in these big cities where the police departments are withdrawing. And we already know that empirically. But there's also this truism: the bigger an organization becomes, the more disconnected it is from the people it's intended to serve. In New York, they have a police department with an $8 billion budget. Hard to imagine. Some states don't have a budget that big, $8 billion. And so I think it would be a great idea to break that police department down into its components, and very specifically to address some of the problems we're seeing today. I think the inner city police should serve the inner city community, not from some bureaucracy far away, but I think it would be great. Let those people elect their own police chief, let them set their own rules of engagement, let them hold their police accountable. I think that would be better for the community, better for the police, and frankly, better for the city at large.
I think there'd be better communication. That's for sure. It's interesting. I talked to a police officer just yesterday, and he said one of the biggest problems is that no one's taking the actual, on a smaller level, the individual, the police officer into account. Even these conversations of reform, even these conversations of how to fix issues, they ignore the actual dynamic of the officer and the community. They just look at it like a global or a national entity, like you said, and that it's universal and that we need to do this universally, when the truth is, I think that changes do have to come on a smaller, more zoomed in level. So yeah, fundamentally, I'm against defunding the police. If anything, like in those areas where you're talking about, they should get more funding so they can fix these issues and they can, in my opinion. But
so I would have more funding and more autonomy. I mean, I think that's the key, is self-governance, right? If a community is in particular frustrated with the way that the police are policing, and by the way, that's not generically true. In most communities of color, they want more police presence, not less police presence. But I do think we should give them control of the way the police operate in their own communities.
It's interesting you said that most people of color want more police presence, and I've seen it, and I've seen there's even interviews of people going to different neighborhoods, and then they go to the rich neighborhood and they ask, rich white people, what do you think these people want in their neighborhood? And they go, oh, those people of color don't want police in their neighborhood. They're speaking for the people of color, which is absurd. And then you go to, I lived in Spanish Harlem, my wife from the Bronx. You want police in those neighborhoods back in the day. Trust me, it was rough. So it's so interesting to me that people who don't live in the neighborhood are trying to dictate what happens in the neighborhood. What did I want to touch on? I wanted to touch on the fact that, well, it's interesting. Actually, you brought up that you're part of the Tea Party, and I'm going to actually potentially bring this in earlier if you want to discuss it. But it's interesting how that party was so vilified, how that's kind of started as a grassroots movement. And then I've always been interested in kind of and this is separate, we don't have to have this in, but it's just fascinating to me how that all kind of took place, and then it got so quickly vilified by the left.
Well, look, there's a reason for it, and I think it ties into the politics of today. So I was a typical Tea Party guy. I was not engaged in politics before the Tea Party. I was a conservatarian, as I said, but I just watched. I didn't participate. To me, it was like a sport almost. It was like my team was the Rams, and I rooted for my team. They were the Republicans at the time, especially during elections. I really paid attention. Other than that, not so much.
Yeah.
When the Tea Party movement happened, the thing that got me going, and this is a story you won't hear about the Tea Party movement, for me, emotionally, mentally, it started when George Bush said a particular thing. And he said, I'm abandoning free market principles to save the free market. And I just thought, what? What?
Yeah.
What kind of world is this guy? Is this Alice in Wonderland? That's insane. That's madness, right? And so they were doing the TARP bailout and all this crazy stuff. And I just thought the spending's out of control. I was really frustrated. Then Obama gets elected. And I will tell you, for me, as a person who was not an Obama supporter, who was a Republican at the time, I wasn't happy he was elected, but I thought this is a really impressive, important moment in American history. There's a part of me that was very happy that he was elected, because I just thought, like, this is a moment when we're putting most of race issues behind us in America.
Yeah.
He was elected also by the majority of whites, voted for him twice. So I thought this is pretty good evidence. And then what I hoped for in a strange way was that he would do everything he promised. not because I agreed with those policies, but because the American people voted for that. And so I expected to see dramatic change. And frankly, not so much. He
Yeah.
said no lobbyists in the White House. We had lobbyists in the White House. Everything was kind of the same, just a little bit different flavor, right? So it was vanilla with chocolate, a little bit of chocolate and chips in it or whatever, as opposed to straight vanilla. It was just the same stuff. And I was horrified by that because I thought if the American people can vote this radically for change and not get it, then the system's broken. So the Tea Party movement started with, first, from my perspective, George Bush doing a lot of really bad stuff, flows into the Obama administration, who just does the same stuff, only more, and people were really frustrated. Then you get the advent of Obamacare, and they're going to ram it down our throats, and that's where you get the Tea Party.
You know what I really admire about you? You could care less about, I mean, you consider yourself a conservative, and this is so rare in politics, and I really want to point this out. You could care less about who wins as long as it's honest to democracy. And you could care less about, you care about the changes, but you will respect the changes that occur as long as they are in line with democracy. In other words, your ultimate protection, it seems, in this country is to protect that the individuals in this country actually have the outcome that they as a majority decided for. In other words, they voted for Obama. I don't need to like Obama. I don't need to be pro his policies that he's implementing, but I hope that he can achieve them because that's what the population voted for. And then
Yeah, I'm not a fan of the government. I am a big fan of the people. So
yes.
what the American people want, whether it's on a microcosm, like a city like Seattle, a lot of people disagree with me when I say this who are conservatives. If Seattle wants the CHOP or the CHAZ or whatever they call it, well, then they should have that. I don't like it. I think it's nuts. I think it's crazy. I think it's evil. I think there's a lot of bad stuff. But if Seattleites want that, really, and they're willing to tolerate that, that's what they should have. And I feel that way at the local, the state, and the national level. The people should get what they want. And when I'm concerned is when I see a disconnect between what the people want and what the people are getting. Like I will say in Seattle right now, I think we have a huge disconnect. I think the people of Seattle are fed up with what Mayor Durkin is doing or not doing. Certainly the people on Capitol Hill there are really fed up. There's 12 people who've now filed a class action lawsuit, and still the mayor's essentially doing nothing. That's a disconnect that concerns me.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of the time the disconnect you're talking about is politically motivated. So I think that a lot of the time what we're seeing right now isn't about serving the people, even if it's under, like you to look at CHAZ. I mean, you're right, most people don't want CHAZ. And I would only come back in the sense that there are some cases where I do believe that what the people want may have to be resisted. And an autonomous zone for me feels like it's almost an act of war on the country as a whole. You can't start having separate countries pop up within a country. But I do actually agree with you overall. I'm kind of torn on it when I listen to how you speak. I'm like, you know what? He makes a lot of sense.
So I would agree with you. I mean, that's when you cross the boundary into lawlessness, and you're dealing with an autonomous zone, which has declared itself outside the United States, that's actually an insurrection. And that's a federal crime. And I believe they should have just rolled in there with federal troops, rounded those people up and thrown them in jail. Aside from that, if they want to let the people take over and be protesting, as long as the law still applies, I'm okay with that. But once it gets outside of the law, then I think you got a serious problem.
I'm fully on the same page as you on that. Yeah, you're absolutely right. What I wanted to also touch on was your background. You have an interesting background. You're not only in politics, but you did grow up in a family of law enforcement. You started telling me about it before. If you'd like to just jump right in and talk about a little bit about your past.
Yeah, like I said, I grew up not far from where you are now, in the San Fernando Valley of Los Angeles. My mom was LAPD Reserve. She became a reserve officer when I was probably, I want to say 16 years old, roughly. And so I remember coming home at night, sometimes after doing things I probably shouldn't be doing. My mom sitting at the kitchen table, sipping on a cup of coffee in her LAPD blacks. Yeah. And, you know, we talk about the police officers in blue. LAPD wears black uniforms. Pretty intense, kind of intimidating. When you're 16 and you come home and maybe you got a little buzz going, it's not necessarily a great thing to meet your mom at the dining room table. So I grew up around that, but that also means I grew up around a lot of cops and really great people. Some of my mom and dad's best friends were from the LAPD, but I also saw some of the stuff inside that my mom would describe that was really frustrating. Bad cops doing bad things. And one of the things that I saw that would frustrate my mom, and we talk about this around the dinner table, is the way the union so staunchly protected even the worst cops. And it created a culture where it was really bad, really difficult, really frowned upon for cops to police themselves.
Hmm.
And I think this is a fundamental problem. Like all of humanity, I think a lot of people are good and there's always going to be a small slice of bad. And the question is, do we police ourselves as communities? And I think the unions have really kept police from policing themselves.
Yeah, it's interesting. Again, since I started this, I've spoken to so many police, and none of them deny that there's a problem. And all of them want to see some kind of change, and all of them want to see things get better and want to build trust with the communities. The whole union issue. When I made the video, a lot of people asked, "Oh, why did you make the video?" And I said, whenever something is above critique, it's part of me to step in and say, no, we should be able to criticize this.
Mhm.
If Black Lives Matter is above critique, they should be criticized. I also said vice versa. If police are above critique, which at this moment I feel they're not, I felt that they needed supporting,
Right.
then I'll step in but if they were above, I would make a video saying we need to be able to address these problems and look at this. Society needs to be able to talk about this. And honestly, I haven't thought enough about the union issue. If you want to expand on it a little bit more, I don't know if you have more to say on it. I find it.
Yeah, I do. So, look, I think this is true of public employee unions generally. I think the very concept of a public employee union is corrupt to the core. It is designed for corruption. And by the way, I'm not opposed to private unions. I'm not an anti-union guy. But here's why it is in the public union, it's so bad. Because the way a public employee union works is they collect dues from their members. By the way, that's your money and my money, right? It's taxpayer monies. They collect those dues and then they spend those dues to elect people. They participate in elections who will then sit across the negotiating table from them and negotiate their contracts.
Yeah.
Well, that's not a negotiation because if I'm a union representative and you're negotiating on behalf of the city, then I just say to you, hey, look, if you don't give us what we want, then I'll just throw you out of office. I'll find some other Joe who will give us what we want. And that's actually how it works. It's also important to note that the vast majority of public employee union dues go to support Democratic candidates who then vote for bigger and bigger contracts and contracts that protect the police, sometimes to the point of a fault. And here's what I mean by that. So if a guy does something obviously incredibly horrible, police officer, the obvious ones, a George Floyd type situation,
Yeah.
the union steps up in total defense of that person.
Really?
And this happens over and over. I can present case after case. The union never says, hey, you know what, time out. We're going to tap out on this one because that's really bad and this person shouldn't be defended. And then there's all kinds of stuff in their contracts that prevents the police department from disciplining bad officers. And these are all put in by the unions. And I don't think that's good. I think it breaks the balance. Now, I want to be clear. I want officers to have full due process. This is super important, right? But they shouldn't have more than due process. And what's happened now, because of the power of the public employee unions, they have what I would describe as super due process, and they shouldn't have that.
It's interesting. It's almost backfired because now you're seeing a public reaction that's so strong over years of potentially having these things occur that in a case like Rolf, they're charging him with felony murder and potentially the death penalty, which is now overcharging before they even did an investigation. It's like the pendulum can just swing one way or the other.
Yeah, and there's more nuance I want to add in here that I think is really important. The idea that there is law enforcement abuse in colors of community, I think it goes without saying. It actually absolutely takes place. Yeah. Anytime you have an imbalance in a power relationship, which you do between the police and people in an inner city community of color, there's going to be abuse. And the police have been doing this forever. And when I say the police, I need to be really careful. 95, 98% of police, great folks, right? They're not the abusers. But the abusers can get away with it. There's a part of the system that I think is really broken too. I've experienced this personally, which is it's the way that crimes get charged. So whatever you get arrested for, and especially if you're in the inner city, you can be sure you're going to be charged with more than you actually did. They're going to overcharge you. This is just the way the system works. So the charging district attorney, assistant district attorney is going to add on crimes, and they're going to do that because they know they can't try all crimes. They don't have the resources. So what they want to do is they want to put you in so much jeopardy that you will enter into a plea bargain. And so it's like this police officer, instead of charging with manslaughter, they charge him with second-degree murder, right? I mean, that's such an extreme charge. That's done for different reasons. But then they can plea you down, and instead of spending life in prison, maybe you spend 20 years in prison. Mm-hmm. And so they force you under this incredible threat of incarceration and the entire machinery of the system to plea down. And Elon, I have a personal experience with this about 8 years ago, I was in New York City. I always travel carrying a gun anywhere it's legal for me because I get death threats as a public figure. I do not carry a weapon in New York City because I'm not legally allowed to. Almost nobody is. But I was there doing a bunch of media. And when I left, I was flying through LaGuardia, and in my luggage was a handgun, unloaded, locked in a TSA-approved lockbox. You declare that when you go to check in. I declared it, and they arrested me. Literally cuffed me at the counter because apparently the rule is in New York City proper, which I didn't know, even though I had researched, you can't have a handgun unless you have a permit. And they charged me with carrying a loaded weapon. Now, I wasn't carrying it, and it wasn't loaded. It was in my luggage, and it was unloaded. And then when they found out I was a public figure, they added intent to do harm. Like, so, never presented any evidence of intent to do harm. Of course, I didn't have intent to do harm. I defend myself, right? I have to defend myself from death threats I get all the time. So they threw me in jail. They overcharged me so that they could plea me down to something else. And so I sat there in Queens Central booking. Whatever you think of jail and think of Queens Central, yes, it's terrifying.
Yeah.
You know, white guy from the suburbs, it was a mess. When I was in there, I heard a lot of the guys talking. I would have discounted this previously, saying, I've been in here 6 days. They're not even telling me what I'm in here for. I've been in here 10 days. No, I mean, it's not a speedy trial. They're not being charged and giving due process. And I experienced it myself. So I just know it's true. This abuse is actually taking place in our criminal justice system.
Well, the criminal justice system has its problems. I've also had, and I've seen certain things that make no sense to me. And I go, wow, this really has to be fixed. And in terms of sentencing disparities and things like that, I would say there's a huge class issue. I would say that if you have money, you can, even beyond race, I would say that if you have money, you can get out of things. If you
Absolutely,
the state will just destroy you. The state will come after you and destroy your life to try and bring you down. Even if they just need a scapegoat. They just need someone who's guilty in a high profile case. And we've seen countless documentaries about this. I don't know if that necessarily has to do specifically with the police. I feel like that almost, like what you're talking about, the average police officer has nothing to do with this and just wants to do their job and help their community. And yet they're pulled into this bigger entity, which has these issues of corruption, which we see in the government. You know, the government in general has corruption. Any large entity that has power will have corruption. And it's unfortunate. Where do you think this attack on police that we're seeing right now, this current rhetoric, this atmosphere, which has gone, we're talking about, I know there was, for the past 10 years, I've noticed that the perception of police has gone downhill. When I was even younger, I went through that phase. But lately, I never imagined it getting this bad this quickly. We're talking about like in 3 months, the police went from being a hero during COVID, being heroes, to being public enemy number one, abolish, targeted for like to hurt them, all this crazy stuff. How did this happen, and why is it happening?
I actually think, and it sounds crazy in conspiracy theory, it's only a conspiracy if it's not true. Yeah. But I do think there are a group of people, it's not average people on the streets, but there are a group of people who want to tear this country down. And in order to do that, you need to create chaos. And I actually think it all goes all the way back to the early days of Marxism. Marxism was imported to this country a long, long time ago. Now, I was raised Jewish. A lot of Jewish people sent their children post-World War I to the Weimar Republic to see Germany and its efficiency and the way the machine operated. And they learned this kind of Marxist ideology over there. Alexander Gramsci, Italian, was a early proponent of this sort of Marxist system of state power. And the Marxists have always said that the state has to be torn down. It cannot be like slowly changed over. You've got to destroy the machinery of the state. Removing the authority of the police is a way of destroying the machinery of the state. And I think that's what this is generally targeted at. They want chaos. I actually think that they want people to respond to some of the chaos with violence, so that then they can say white supremacy, they can say, you know, rich people eating the poor people or whatever. And so they want more and more chaos. The more chaos there is, the more ability there is for a government to become authoritarian, which is the root of Marxism. They need that authoritarian structure in place. So the chaos leaves an opening for authoritarians to step in and impose a new regime.
I literally just made a video about this. It's so interesting because I'm fundamentally on the same page as you, that there is clearly an insidious force behind a lot of this that is here. There's no question that the attack on police has to do with a lot more than just the police. They're our last line of defense to preventing anarchy. And then when you have anarchy, you create an opening for power. It's exactly the same
Right.
exact thing.
Yeah.
What I've noticed is beyond that, they've just managed to destroy objective truth, which is very scary, because I would imagine that's a part of Marxism as well. If you can make everything kind of subjective or relative, then good and bad cease to matter. All of this stuff just kind of goes out the window. And so I've noticed even Teen Vogue put up a thing defending Marxism, Karl Marx, like this revisionist history celebrating Marxism. It's in the country. People can try and deny it, but it's in the country. And as someone whose family was in different countries that were targeted, my mother had to escape Baghdad, Iraq. My dad, it was also a Jew and post-Holocaust, born right at the end of the Holocaust. I've seen these kind of oppressive, or I've learned about these oppressive governments. And people should be very scared. It's crazy to me how quickly it's kind of taken hold.
You know, it always starts, Elon, with the best motives and the best intent, right? We're going to make everything fair for everybody. We're going to have health care for everybody. Everybody has a right to housing. Everybody has a right to food, and all of these things, these universal civil rights. This is how fascism, Marxism, communism, they always start like this. And when people look back at World War II and they talk about Hitler and the Nazi regime, most people forget that Hitler was democratically elected.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's not like he swept into power by force. He was elected by the people. He had some legitimate grievances that he was raising about the way that Germany had been treated after World War I. People were frustrated. He tapped into that. And so then that later on turned into the truly evil thing that Hitler became. But people forget that these things start with good intentions, right? We got to get rid of all the rich people who are hoarding all the stuff, and got to make sure everybody has their fair share. It all sounds good and pretty. And if you look at modern history, though, so far it's led to something like 150 million people dead. And it drives me crazy because I hear people on the left say, well, you know, really, true communism has never been tried. And my response to that is, do we need 200 million dead, 250? Like, when is it that you'll say it's been tried and it's failed?
Well, there's an interesting thing I've noticed that's different between people who are conservative and people who are liberal. And that's liberals don't actually care about real world application. They care about the ideal. And they'll focus on the ideal more than anything. Healthcare for all, it doesn't matter if healthcare comes down for everyone to a terrible, terrible point. It just matters the ideal that we all have equal treatment. You look at this for anything, gun rights. Well, no guns in a world, idealistically, is a better world. No one would have guns. No one would have weapons. We would all just be wonderful. You know, in your mind, it's like a dream world, but they don't look at the real world application of how this applies. They'll attach to the ideal versus the reality-based application, whereas conservatives tend to say, no, this is reality. I don't have to like the world I'm currently living in. I have to look at what will fix it and how it's actually going to play out. And if the ideal does not get there, then it's not worth it.
Yeah, I always say that reality is an acquired taste. And, you know, sometimes it's really bitter, and you have to learn that I'm just going to taste that bitterness so that I can look at reality. Where folks on the left, they live in a world that in their mind, it is as they believe it to be, not is as it actually is.
I want to just touch on something you said. You said these things start from good intentions, but I actually don't necessarily know that they do on a couple of levels. On one level, I think that the implication that taking money from other people to redistribute it is inherently wrong. I don't think that's a good intention. I think that's
I absolutely agree. Look, one of the things about property rights are fundamental to what it means to be an American. And this was a pretty unique thing in human history. This actually, by the way, comes out of France. We say you have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the French Bastiat actually said life, liberty, and property, right? And we took property out of the equation in our founding documents because it was inherently tied to slavery. And so the founders knew that that would be a problem. But property, your personal property, everything I see in your house there is an extension of you as a human being. The only reason that you have the easel behind you or the couch or live in the house you live in is because you took your own life and your own energy and you invested it in a way that allowed you to obtain these goods. And so that property is an extension of you. And when you take property away from somebody without due process, specifically by force or redistribution, you're actually directly infringing on personal liberty.
Now, this kind of approach to dealing with society, redistribution of wealth, that gender ceases to exist, it's all a social construct. You know, nothing is true. The gun rights, all these things kind of coming into play. they've infiltrated the media, they've infiltrated the education system heavily.
Sure.
Politicians at this point aren't really pushing back on some of these things. They've become very weak. What's the solution? How do you fight back against that kind of thing?
Okay, I think this is really difficult, but I think the question is an individual one. You know, the question is, will you stand? I mean, the reason that you and I actually met in the first place is because I saw your ad and I said, wow, this is a guy who's actually willing to stand. And I knew potentially there were severe consequences for you and your family, for your business, for your acting career. And I was attracted to that because you were willing to stand. I was attracted enough, by the way, I bought my first watch from you guys. And I was literally within minutes of seeing that video, I went on the website and bought a watch. And it wasn't because I needed a new watch, although you can't have too many watches. It was because you took a stand. And so the question is, for everybody who's watching this, will you take a stand? And what will your stand be? And for me, often the stand is as simple as you're sitting around a family dinner and somebody says something insane and you want to bite your lip, but you shouldn't. We live in a time period in history where you can't bite your lip. If you're in the break room at work and people are spouting insane stuff that's bad, stuff that's immoral or amoral, I think you got to stand. You got to be a lighthouse against the storm. And so I think that's the way we do it, is we give individuals the courage to stand. You do that because you're standing, right? And people watch you, people like me see you and say, that guy's standing. And they don't have to stand like you. They don't have to put their whole company at risk, but they got to stand. And until enough of us stand, we're going to continue to lose the country.
I agree with you again. I think complacency is the death of America. It's not necessarily going to be the small minority. It's going to be us allowing them, the small kind of vocal minority, to take control and not do anything in the process. And we've already seen it. And we've already seen how quickly things can change. That was one of my biggest shocks, because I always heard it. And you always hear people on the left say, oh, you don't need gun rights because the government is never actually going to get fascist. And then I'm like, well, you cannot make that argument anymore. That's gone. That's off the table now. Your gun rights argument is gone forever.
You know, and it's going so fast right now. I just recorded a video on Sunday night. I wore a shirt that our organization had designed, has the Betsy Ross flag on it and says "Just Fly." Remember the controversy around Nike? Mm-hmm. So this was the huge this is a big deal. Nike was had a shoe design, and on the back of the shoe, about this big, was going to be the Betsy Ross flag, and that was just a huge controversy. And so we protested against it. We had our shirts made, like that was our big stand. I never imagined that. That's just a matter of months ago. People would be talking about blowing up Mount Rushmore, taking down statues of George Washington. You talk about the speed at which this is accelerating. It's crazy.
And more so the speed at which it's affecting the political kind of arena, that where Republican politicians are very much. Who's the Republican politician who just yesterday made it easier? I don't know if it was just yesterday, but made it easier to sue police and is defending kind of BLM as a whole, as an organization, despite the ties to Marxism, despite the leader of BLM coming out and openly saying that she's a trained Marxist. I mean, you have Republicans now defending this kind of stuff and pushing for this kind of stuff. I've noticed that the biggest political arm in the country right now is the people bringing in the most money, which is at this moment BLM. So everyone will just go along with whatever's happening because they don't want to fight against what could potentially be funding them or what could potentially be the future of the country. Tucker Carlson really touches on it very well. I'm very surprised by how much he's taking a stand on this kind of stuff, because he's just been talking about the need to push back against all this and protect our freedom of speech.
Yeah, I saw Tucker at a live event about, I want to say, a year ago, and it was in Minnesota. Minnesotans are the nicest people in the world. It's just the most docile state you can imagine. And he gave a speech, which was his usual. He's funny. He's a great extemporaneous speaker, just an engaging guy. So he gave a great speech. And towards the end of the speech, he said, all right, now comes the serious part. And he said, we are engaged in a war. This is a war for our culture. It's a war for our country. It's a war for our faith. It's a war for our children. And he said, and you people here in Minnesota that are so nice, you better learn not to be so nice, because they're not going to be nice to you. And he described where this came from for him. He said that one day he came home and his wife sat him down and he said, she's from Los Angeles. She's kind of liberal, or not as conservative as he might be, never engaged in politics, not really interested. And she sat him down and she said, Tucker, they're coming for our children. And they're trying to change what our children believe. And they're trying to teach our children instead of us. And they don't want our children to believe like we believe. And they're not taking my children. And she went off, and he said, Mama Bear went off. And she told me, this is not fun and games what you're doing anymore. This is a war that we're in, and you got to take this seriously. And he said, she hammered him that he's not serious enough, that he doesn't get how serious this is. And I think this is now coming home to roost, that a lot of people are realizing, holy cow, they actually intend, they're openly saying, and we have one of the BLM leaders now saying, you don't give us what you want, we're going to burn down the whole system.
Oh, yeah. They're openly, by the way, it's not just the leaders of BLM. I've encountered this. I'm on all the forums. I talk to people. The main language used is burn it all down, that the system itself is corrupt. And it all comes back to capitalism for them. They always say that capitalism is inherently racist, is inherently corrupt, is inherently wrong, and has to be done away with. That's where the conversation always goes. It's never just about, any conversation about Black Lives Matter, when I dig into it, is never just about fixing the communities, never about all this stuff. It's about how America itself is wrong, how the experiment of America, the structure, the foundations of this country are wrong, and we have to tear it down. And many people are starting to believe this, many younger people, which is what's so dangerous, because they're going to get to an age where they vote. They're going to get to an age where they're running the country. And from such a young age, they're being indoctrinated. I see it with my niece and nephews, the stuff they're being taught in school. Like you said, they're coming for our kids. It's already there. You look at the education system, it's become so revisionist. It's become one-sided, and there's no open dialogue, no open debate, and people are scared. That's why when I said, how do you fix this? How do you take a stand? When I was asking you, I feel like if we lose education, then we've lost the battle. So, I don't know if there's a way to fix that. If you need to get more people with diversity of opinion into teaching, or
I don't think that's going to happen, because the academy is now training only leftists. So to get your teaching credential, you effectively have to be a leftist, or at least pretend to be a leftist. And my daughter is in education reform. That's what she does professionally, works for a foundation, private foundation here in Texas. It's bad. Whatever you think it is, it's worse than you think it is. I think the education system gets saved primarily, it sounds crazy, but by homeschoolers. When I travel around the country and I meet homeschoolers all over the country, every time I do, I think, thank God there are kids out there with some common sense who understand how the real world works, who know our history. And I think we are at an opportune moment. If you think about it, every kid in the United States of America became a homeschooler because of this pandemic, 100%. It's maybe 1% are homeschooled in the United States of America normally. So now it's 100%, at least the end of this semester. By the time kids go back to school, if they go back to school at this point, they'll all have been out of school 6 months. What happens if 1 or 2 or 3% of them don't go back? And I predict that's going to happen. Yep. You're going to see homeschooling jump from 1% of the population, maybe to 5% of the population. That has the potential to transform our education system.
Oh, that's interesting. I never even thought about that. And you're right that the battle's kind of lost on that front, and the way to beat it is to just homeschool, beat it on an individual level. Like you said, it all comes back to that with you, I know.
And by the way, I want to also correct an impression that I had about homeschooling, because I wasn't homeschooled. I didn't know any homeschoolers until I got into politics. And I always thought, well, like, how would I homeschool? Me and my wife both work. Like, how could you possibly teach your kid? I can't sit with my kids all day long. One is I didn't realize how much structure and curriculum is available for parents that homeschool their kids. It's not like you sit at the kitchen table with your kid all day long. It doesn't have to be that way. I also didn't realize all over the country are homeschool co-ops where you get with other parents, and they actually hire some teachers, and there's tutoring. Like, if I had to teach my kids algebra, forget it. Right? And so luckily there are these co-ops, and there's combination schools that are part private, part homeschool. So there's all kinds of ways that we are reinventing the education system in America. And I think what we have to do as people who, I wasn't homeschooled, is we have to think about blowing up the box and not thinking inside the box anymore. When I thought of school, I just thought, you go to grammar school, you go to middle school, you go to high school, you go to college, and it's all the way through your public. We should not think that way anymore. We should think anything's possible, especially with the technology we have today.
Well, I think touching on that, we have to really rethink the way education can create value in general. Because like you're saying, I mean, all the benefits that I've created in my life didn't have to do with school. They had to do with sometimes going to, not traditional school, but let's say going to trade school. In trade school, I could learn a specific tool that I could then apply to myself. But a lot of it also came from just having great conversations with my father, or learning on my own. And there's such a new way, people say hack your education. The world has changed dramatically since the internet, since everything with social media, since the way if this happened, this pandemic happened in the 80s, it would be a much different world in terms
Oh,
of how we would deal with it. And so there are so many opportunities to give kids nowadays where they can have a much more guaranteed value in life. Like having a liberal arts degree does not necessarily get you a job when you graduate. A gender studies degree does not necessarily add to your ability to create value in the world when you graduate and you want to go out and work. And there's a lot of people who can learn things at home. I'd rather see my kid at home on the computer doing Adobe Photoshop tutorials than out in certain classes that they're going to be learning in school from a young age. That's an applicable skill, whatever it may be. I mean, I kind of feel that there's so much value out there that you can create this new way of thinking about education. So I'm full on with you that I think homeschooling I never even thought about it before this conversation. I'm keeping this whole conversation going just selfishly because I'm learning from you in the process.
So you know what, this is interesting to me because we're in a time right now where if you watch the media, whether it's left or right, it's universally dark, right? The perspective is just if you're watching the left, everybody's a racist.
Yes.
Everything's terrible. If you're watching the right, we're going to lose our country. Everything's terrible. I'm always a glass 3/4 full guy. And here's what I'll tell you about the current time. You and I live in the most amazing time in human history to be alive. I think, so look, we're potentially on this razor's edge. One side, we can veer off into the new dark ages. The other side is the Renaissance, like we've never seen before. The ability to use these computers in ways that we've never even imagined. The way the human race is accelerating its use of technology is incredible. Medicine, incredible. The things we're curing today that were just impossible 10, 15, 20 years ago. Right? But because of this pandemic, and I would argue also because of the way society is kind of breaking down right now, the paradigm is being broken. And a paradigm is a very powerful cage that we all live inside of. All of us live inside of a paradigm. And when the paradigm starts to crumble, anything's possible. You can reimagine everything. So I think we live in a time where, for example, we can reimagine education. We talked about that. Healthcare. So many people are dealing with telemedicine right now because of this pandemic. Telemedicine should completely change the way we do medicine. Imagine you live in a small town in rural Kansas. You could see the best doctor at the Mayo Clinic for most things. You don't have to go to the Mayo Clinic anymore. Mostly, by the way, the insurance companies and the medical associations have prevented the widespread use of telemedicine. Trump issued some executive orders busting that wide open. We should leave it wide open. So we can transform the way we do medicine. We can transform the way we do education. We can transform the way we do entertainment. And people are actually going to concerts online right now. We can't all get together. I've seen some incredible artistic endeavors. You get giant choruses of people together on the internet because of technology, because of the way we can re-envision the way we do art. I think we can re-envision the way we do government is incredible. We're re-envisioning the way we do faith. This has been an amazing thing. So in my church, we're doing online church. A lot of churches have for months and months. A church that I went to in Northern California that has 20,000 members of its congregation on a weekend in multiple services, they'll serve 20,000. They're serving 80 and 100,000 online. So faith is exploding. We live in a time when things are difficult. A lot of people turn to faith. So we're worried about the country losing its faith. Well, a lot of people are turning to faith. It may not look like what we're used to in the paradigm. We're in a time when anything is possible, Elon. So I'm really excited. I just think guys like you, who I consider kind of a visionary, the paradigm's busted. It's time for people like us to look outside the paradigm.
I mean, I'm so happy we had, speaking on faith, I recently kind of found my faith. I've always struggled with it. I'm a hyper intellectual person. And so it was very hard for me to kind of believe in something beyond myself. And so I've recently, in the past year, I always had a calling, but in the past year, especially, I've really, really felt the kind of greater understanding that there is something bigger than myself, that there is something to live for that is greater than myself. And it's a really wonderful feeling when you kind of discover it and you kind of accept it and you stop intellectualizing it. So when you said faith is kind of being reimagined, I think part of it that allowed me to reimagine it is everything going on right now.
Yeah, like, it's funny you said you hyper intellectualize it. You were both raised in Jewish families.
Yeah.
So I became a Christian at 51 years old, and I went through everything. Like I was raised in a 2-parent Jewish family. I would call it, we're secular Jews. You know, we practiced the holidays, but I didn't really know what they meant, really. We lit the menorah. occasional Passover Seder. That was pretty much it. Ritual Jews, I would call us. Still totally hardcore connected to my Jewish heritage, both sides of the family from Ukraine. I mean, we're a Jewish family all the way back. But I studied Buddhism, I studied Jainism, I went to India. I looked at all of it, right? I looked at all the faith traditions. The last one I came to was Christianity. For me, the most interesting part was becoming a Christian. I just read lots of stuff, just like you're doing, like intellectualized it. And one day I just made my faith decision, but I was being interviewed by a guy by the name of Marvin Olasky. He runs World Magazine, which is the largest Christian magazine in the world. And he's a former Marxist and a Jew. And he was asking me to tell him my conversion story, and I was kind of embarrassed because it's not like something happened. I didn't have a moment on a mountain where the clouds, no angels sang or anything. And I said, I don't know. It's like at some point I just felt like that makes sense to me more than not believing. And he goes, yeah, well, that's because you're Jewish. And I said, well, what do you mean by that, Marvin? He said, that's our intellectual tradition, right? We intellectualize everything. Especially if you grew up in a two-parent Jewish family, everything's talked about, everything's debated, everything's discussed. There's the old joke, if you have two Jews in a room, you have three sides to an argument, right? So we argue and we intellectualize everything. And he said, all the Jews that I know that have come to faith have done it in that way, work our way through it. And one day we're like, okay, yeah, that makes sense to me. So that's how I came to faith as well.
Oh, it's so fascinating. Yeah, your breakdown of Jews is pretty accurate. It's different. The dynamic between Middle Eastern Jews, like my mother, she's an Iraqi Jew, and then my father, who's a Hungarian Jew. They're so different culturally, and I feel like the hyper intellectualization side comes from the more European Jewish side.
Yeah.
But it's great the way you broke it down. And I was actually going to ask you about your journey, to be totally honest. When I heard you were a Christian and you said, oh, I was a Jew when I was born, I wanted to know the journey. So
well, I'll give you the short version of a long story, which is all of that stuff. So when I was a kid, I was raised in a secular family. By the time I got to college, I was a militant atheist and a religion hater, specifically really a Christian hater. Mm-hmm. And, look, I learned in college the same thing kids learn today. The worst force ever in the history of humankind is Christianity. It's responsible for the Crusades. It's responsible for all this hatred between religions. So that's what I learned. So by the time I came out, it's embarrassing in hindsight. I was writing poetry basically saying how anti-Christian I was. Mm-hmm. So I was militant. I would describe myself as a mean atheist, right? It was not an accepting atheism. It's I know better, I have the answers, and you people are just stupid and backwards. And over time, I just grew up. Part of it was having kids and looking at my kids and thinking, that's a freaking miracle. Like there's nothing outside of a miracle that makes sense to that. Mm-hmm. Except for that there's something greater than myself. So I became more and more open. I married a woman who was a person of faith. Lord knows why she married me. I mean, I think there's a special place in heaven for people who marry non-believers when they're believers. She was very patient with me for 21 years of marriage, which is incredible.
Wow. Yeah.
And then I started to meet people who were people of faith who I fell in love with. And I just thought, what is it about this person? And I love people. I think you can probably tell. And I reach out to people. And so I started asking people, like, why? You seem so grounded. You seem so happy. You seem so at peace. You seem so kind. Where's that come from? And I kept hearing over and over, well, it's my relationship with Christ. And which to me sounded really weird at first, but I heard it enough times. I thought, I got to check this out, because all these people who I really admire are saying a version of the same thing. So I started reading a bunch of apologetics. For the first time in my life, I started reading scripture. I'm so judgmental. I had never read any scripture, right? So I read Old Testament, New Testament. I started studying. And then for me as a Jew, there's a really important moment for me as a Jew that happened, which is I had a mentor who asked me this question. He said, do you know how Judaism and Christianity came to be separated, right? They both come from the same root. Yeah, of course. How'd they come to be separated? I said, well, I don't know. Christ is born. He lives. He's crucified. And if you believe that he's resurrected, then you're a Christian. And if you don't, then you're a Jew. Yeah. And he said, yeah, that's wrong. And I said, well, what do you mean that's wrong? He said, I'm not going to tell you. Go figure it out. Your history is way off, way off. And so I went and I dug in. And basically, again, long story, what I found out is there's a 150-year period after the resurrection of Christ, if you believe in the resurrection of Christ, a 150-year period where the people who believed that Christ was the Messiah we're Jews. They didn't say we're Christians. They never said, hey,
Of course.
we don't believe in any of that stuff anymore. We believe in this. They were the Jews who believed that the Messiah had come.
Yeah.
And so as a Jew, there's this weird thing that was inside me. I think it's inside all of us who are Jews because of history. Like, if I became a Christian, I betrayed my heritage as a Jew. Like, I'm not a Jew anymore. And I realized I'm looking at that. Well, that's not true, because the original Christians were Jews. And then I started studying Paul. Paul says when he's in Rome that he's a Hebrew among Hebrews. Like, he's preaching the Christian gospel, the saving gospel of Jesus Christ. And the Jews, the leaders, come to him in Rome and say, hey, you know, we hear you've kind of bailed on being a Jew and you've given up. And he goes, no, that's ridiculous. And he says, I'm a Hebrew among Hebrews. And I said, well, come to temple with us and do the rituals and pay for our rituals. He said, yeah, of course, absolutely. And so what I realized is I can still be a Jew and be Christian. Of course, I'm not a religious Jew, but being Jewish is my heritage. And frankly, if you're Christian, then being Jewish is your heritage. If you deny that, you don't understand what it means to be Christian. So that's kind of how I became a Christian.
I went to a monastery with a friend. I was working on a TV show right before the pandemic hit, and he took me to a Christian monastery. It was one of the most interesting experiences I've ever had. They had like hermits there and everything, but it was the first time that I felt at peace in a very, very long time. Like, I felt when I was in there, I couldn't touch my phone. People were just so kind. And so that kind of feeling you're talking about, by the way, I get that a lot from people as well, that feeling of just warmth, of peace, of being grounded. And I realized because you're living for something greater than yourself, you all of a sudden feel like it's okay what you're doing in the world. And it doesn't mean you don't strive to be better. You actually do strive more so than others often, because you're living for a higher purpose. Any argument I've had with my wife, let's say it's a matter of just tension over, like, we're stuck in the house together, whatever the things may be, whatever hardships in life. So I was talking to my friend about this at the monastery, and he said a lot of relationships are damaged because we put on the other person what we should be putting on something higher than ourselves. And so you need a relationship with something else. You can have a relationship with your girlfriend, with your wife, but that relationship will never fulfill this other thing that most people just inside of them are looking for. And oftentimes now, because of so much nihilism, we're putting that on people when we can't, or we put it on ourselves, which we can't. I used to believe I could put this on myself. Absolutely. I can handle it. It's for me, right? And then I realized, no, it's not. It's bigger than me. And so if I do try and take that on, where do I end up? I end up with depression. I end up with anxiety. And I've lived a lot of my life with depression and anxiety. Yeah. And even OCD, because my mind is trying to rationalize something greater than the human mind can rationalize. And when you allow that to be something bigger than yourself, when you put that out there in the world, I think it fixes a lot of relationships. I would argue one of the biggest problems we're seeing in society today, a lot of the reasons we're seeing this dehumanization, we're seeing this violence, is because if I do not see you as divine, and I don't care what religion that is, what faith it is, it doesn't matter. But if I do not see you as a human that is divine, if you're just some physical object that was created in the world, then you have no true value to me. But if I have that, if I can see you as a spiritual being, then you matter. You matter beyond your race. You matter beyond your religion. You matter beyond your gender. All of it goes out the window because you are divine. You are unique. And so I can never hurt that. And so if we brought that back into society in the right way, right, without the kind of traumas of religion that you're talking about, then religion could actually do beautiful things for the world. It's just a question of how do you do it. But
it's what human beings do with stuff, right? And so for me, like, one of my mentors who helped me figure all this stuff out, one day he asked me, after I had already come to be a believer, he said, you really love people, don't you? And I said, yeah, I always have. Like, relationships are the most important thing in my life. I have friends that I've had for 30 years. I just stay in touch with people. I care about people. And he said, do you know why that is? And I said, I don't know. It's how I am. And he said, because every time you look at a human being, you see the spark of God in their eyes. And if you get close to them, you're closer to God. The more people you're close to, the closer you are to God. Because God made each and every one of us. And he said, so that's how you're wired, because God's inside there. God made each person. And it made perfect sense to me once he said it. I never thought of it that way.
Yeah, no, it's beautiful. Mark, I'm not going to hold you up anymore. I mean, I honestly, I'll just go on for hours. So I just want to say thank you, man. It's always just an honor talking to you, and I learned so much. So.
All right, well, we got to close with this. Okay, so this watch, if you guys don't have one, you got to get one. All right? I love this watch. And I have another one that you sent to me, which I love even more, which I don't have on right now. And I can tell you it's now become a problem because I find myself perusing your catalog almost every day thinking, okay, what's going to be the next one? And if your viewers don't know this, one of the coolest things that I'm starting to do now is you can take them apart and you can change them and you can add different bands. And so it's really interesting because I'm an artist myself. I love to write. I used to paint a lot. And so there is an art in the way your watches are put together, which is different than any other watch company out there. So if you're an artist, if you're somebody who likes to have unique things that where you can actually take something and make it your own, Haggard Watches. There's no better place, man.
It's the best sponsor I could get.
There
And also I want people to follow you. So I'm going to put your information in the description below. So everyone watching, please follow Mark. He's brilliant. And I learn a lot from him every time we talk. So thanks so much for watching and please follow Mark.